All right, everyone, we're continuing on with Standard 1.3. This is the second and last of the two presentations about the material that covers with the standard. Today, we're going to talk more primarily about corruption in the cities when it relates to governments. And we've already talked about with 1.3 in this standard, the challenges that the working poor face as the country continues to industrialize and also urbanize, and what's kind of going on in the urban setting. So not that this is directly related to growing working class. It is in some extent. But what's going on in the urban cities and the urban setting during this time period and in relations to government. And so today our essential questions are: explain how political machines work. And the next one is, were political machines good or bad in the Gilded Age? And this is an opinion question. There's no wrong answer. However, what I want you to do is make sure that you're backing your claim, good or bad, with the evidence. So overall, you think it was good because of this. Overall, you think it was bad because of this. It's a simple response, and just as long as you have some evidence from either the lecture or outside evidence, if you wish to go into a little more depth about this, as long as you have that, then that will be acceptable answer. Okay. So some basic context here. The demands for the city governments continue to increase in the Gilded Age. We talked about, more and more people are moving, the problems that come with urbanization, and they look to governments to try to solve some of these issues. And they do so with limited resources. So looking for things like better sewers, clean water, transit systems, more housing, schools, hospitals, and space for businesses were all these issues that were put onto the shoulders of these governments that had really limited resources. The tax base was not strong enough to be able to pay for these things. So what ends up happening, maybe organically, is that you see the rise of an American invention known as the political urban machine. And so what these, this whole system works at is you have political parties that would work to get and stay in power, and they would help bring order to the cities through, usually one strong man that was the head of these political machines. And the city itself was divided into multiple districts, and each one of those districts had a boss, a party, or somebody who led that district, so forth, that answered to these political bosses. And so this whole kind of centralized form of government and how cities ran were very much reliant on the use of private businesses to help solve some of these issues. You need a train system built, you turn to the private businesses to help you build them. You need a new government building built, you turn to the private businesses to build them. And in doing so, they would award these contracts that were, very large. So the cost was the cost in terms of building this, but sometimes the cost wouldn't always reflect the amount of the contract to begin with. Mm-hmm. Now, this is where the corruption in the cities starts to kind of happen. So all of that's good and fine, and it still happens to an extent today. But what was going on is, if you are building something that, say, would cost $1 million, you're building a new building and it costs $1 million, and then you made the contract where it's costing that you're awarding for $5 million, the money that was being spent, $1 million to build it, what's going to happen to the other $4 million? Well, part of it, 2 parts of it would go to the contractor, and then 1 part of that would go to the politicians that gave out those contracts to begin with, something we call kickbacks. Now, this is completely illegal in today's world, and to some extent it was back then, but these political machines controlled everything. They controlled the police, they controlled the city governments and everything. It just, no one was there to stop them, other than people who are trying to bring attention to these corrupt businesses. And eventually some people will go after them as prosecutors. But that's far away at this point. So they are able to stay in power for those reasons, and because, they continue to accumulate money and power and so forth. They also were encouraging widespread voter fraud. And many of these political bosses and these parties would go to the docks in New York City and as these immigrants are coming off the votes, and then they would, sign them up to vote as soon as they could, and vote for me, and I will get you these things, and this kind of scratch my back and I'll scratch yours mentality is something that was definitely seen both from the voters and the people they are electing, as well as the people, the government officials, and the private businesses. So, they encourage people to vote multiple times, and things they did to make that possible. Say you go vote at a polling place, and you have just a full-on beard. You go vote, and then you go to a barbershop, and then you shave that beard, and you leave a nice big mustache, right? And then you vote again because person who's there probably doesn't recognize you for the first time they voted. And remember, this is like before registration and voting and such. I mean, basically, you show up at a polling station, you put your vote into a ballot box, you walk away, and people trusted you to not do that corruptly, but it happened. Oh, and then you can go to the barber a third time and shave the mustache, and then show up again and vote for a third time. And this is, of course, is legal, and you don't, this doesn't happen today. At least we hope it doesn't. And that's, how these parties stayed in power, And so the best example of these party bosses is Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall in New York City. Boss Tweed ran New York City for roughly 12 years. The source of his power was known as Tammany Hall, the party headquarters, and pretty much the city hall within New York City. Everything kind of ran through there. So if you wanted to get something done in the city and build like a new building, you had to go through Tammany Hall to make sure it happens. And so, there's like a dichotomy with the political machine, something we'll dive into a little bit more. But on one hand, Boss Tweed gave very generously to the poor in providing programs to help the poor and the working poor and immigrants and so forth. But at the same time, he stole millions of dollars from the city in taxpayer money through these corrupt bargains. And so, as I mentioned, they give out these huge contracts, these businesses. The contract agrees to pay this amount. When the job is done, there's this much money left over. Some of it would go to the business, and some of it would go in a kickback to the politician who wrote that contract to begin with. And so, Boss Tweed is going to be an individual, and I'm going to move me down here real quick. He's going to be an individual that is going to be very famous because eventually a very brave prosecutor saw what he was doing and saw how terrible this was. He is going to convict him in a court of law of corruption and things like that. And he goes to prison. He escapes prison, and he gets to Spain, where somehow the political cartoons of Boss Tweed, as we kind of see here, make him recognizable, and somebody recognizes him in Spain because of these cartoons and reports to the Spanish government. The Spanish government then extradites him back to the United States, and he goes back to prison and dies about 5 years later. But I just kind of neat little story how this guy was able to be recognized just because of all of the political cartoons that were made in magazines like Harper's Weekly. So political machines are something that happened, and we'll talk about there's responses to try to stop where political machines have less of the corruption in today's society. But there's definitely, when you look back on history and we judge history and what happens in history, we can really ask ourselves, were they good or were they bad overall? And so political machines, the fact that you can say they were good overall for helping build this country and organizing city governments and so forth, they were able to help develop the cities at a time which they had limited resources, and they were able to kind of create some sort of, relationship with private businesses in doing that, to where private businesses could provide jobs, they can provide work, and they could build these cities as they needed to through this system. They would provide valuable services to the working poor to help them in dealing with the issues that we had talked about in the previous lecture. And so there's that good side, and then there's the bad side. It's like extraordinarily corrupt, bribery, taking stolen taxpayer money and these kickbacks and such. And it's extremely undemocratic when they're encouraging voter fraud, and they're encouraging people to rig the system so that they continue to stay in power regardless of what happens. That is something that we must look at it and say, was this something that was good or bad overall? So that's something that I'll let you kind of marinate on and think about, and your responses. If these existed today, knowing that they're corrupt, but also being able to get the job done fairly well, would you be willing to accept that? That is something of a very ethical question of what to think about on that side. Okay, so make sure you respond to your essential questions in Canvas page, and submit them to me. Make sure you take the time to write reasonable answers and use the evidence from the lecture or any outside knowledge to help respond to this. This is how you're able to get 3s and 4s on these responses when they're graded, so that you need to show me that you are understanding the material and that you're watching it at the same time. So make sure you're taking the time to do that right, and it'll help you better understand, hopefully, and do well on the assessments. Okay. So without further ado, that's it from Mr. Henry's classroom, and I will see you all next time.